BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this special weekend episode of Black Box Online Radio. If by chance this is the first episode that you clicked on from this channel, I do a regular segment that you heard about in the introduction called the Anything Goes Friday, where any subject is fair game, and yesterday was one of the few times where I just simply could not decide on which episode to do, and I wanted to do both of them, because for some time I had been meaning to do this episode on an event that was known as the Knoxville Nightmare, the murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, and I did 2 episodes about it back in 2020. However, I also need to share some corrections from those previous episodes and the journey along with obtaining that information and the responses that I got from you guys in the comments section. Big thank you to everyone who has listened to the previous episodes, and I will include some links to those. But first, to give an introduction to the event known as the Knoxville Nightmare, I'm going to go over to an article that had been shared on Murderpedia. They actually had a very good compilation of writing about the Knoxville Nightmare. Channon Christian, age 21, and Hugh Christopher Newsom, more commonly known as Chris, were a couple from Knoxville, Tennessee. They were both tortured and murdered after being kidnapped in the early morning of January 7, 2007. Their vehicle had been carjacked. 5 suspects were arrested and charged in the case. The grand jury indicted 4 of the suspects on counts of murder, robbery, kidnapping, rape, and theft. 3 of those arrested were Latalvis D. Cobbins, Lemaricus Davidson, and George Thomas. They have been convicted on multiple charges, including several counts of felony murder. After a jury trial, Lemaricus Davidson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Latalvis Cobbins and George Thomas were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Vanessa Coleman, the only female member of the group, has been convicted of facilitating the crimes and sentenced to 53 years in prison, and Eric Boyd has been convicted of federal charges as an accessory after the fact and sentenced to 18 years in prison. And to give an introduction onto how these crimes took place, Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom had gone on a date at a local restaurant on Saturday, January 6, 2007, but did not return home. During their night out, the couple were hijacked, carjacked, bound, and blindfolded by 3 males and taken back to the home of Lemaricus Davidson, who was known as Slim. That was his nickname. And they went to the house that he had rented on Chipman Street. Christian's parents found the abandoned Toyota 4Runner 2 blocks away from the Chipman house, and the following Monday, with the help of a mobile phone provider, they continued the search. An envelope was recovered from the vehicle and that yielded fingerprint evidence that led the police to Lemaricus Davidson and 2316 Chipman Street. When police went to the address on Tuesday, January 9th, they found the home unoccupied and Channon Christian's body was in a trash can in the kitchen. The first point is, I learned about this case because of an episode of The Savage Nation, which was hosted by Michael Savage, and he, like many other commentators, were pointing out that the Knoxville Nightmare, the torturous murder of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, was not very well covered by the mainstream media, and there are numerous motives for that. But also, he was pointing out the heinous nature of the crime, and it really is quite gruesome, even if you've read these details multiple times. But almost every source, every news agency that did cover the story points out that it began with a carjacking. However, as you just heard there from this post that had been in the introduction to Murderpedia, the Toyota 4Runner vehicle was found abandoned. And maybe there's some things that are taken out of it, but they really present it as a carjacking. However, auto theft is clearly not the primary motive. And then to jump ahead a little bit, only because I mentioned that exact detail, that they found Channon Christian's body in a trash can in the kitchen. The forensics teams did a very, very thorough job when it came to examining the crime scene. And Lemaricus Davidson, the ringleader and the person who was connected to the crime scene via fingerprints and then determined to be the ringleader of the group, I should say, had his palm print on the trash bag, and his palm print was extended in a way that would have been equivalent of lifting the body, a body of equal weight to Channon Christian, meaning he is the only person who could have lifted her body in that trash bag and put her in the trash can. So, I mean, if I were a defense attorney, I would just be saying, oh dear Lord, what am I going to do now? I mean, that's some pretty damning evidence of his guilt, because even if you're going to play the card that, well, something else could have happened, no, he's the one who put her body in that trash can, and he was the one who had lifted the trash bag containing her remains. Now, I'll go back to the post. According to the testimony of the Knox County Acting Medical Examiner, Dr. Darnika Milusenik Polchan, at the subsequent trial of Eric Boyd, Newsom was repeatedly sodomized with an object and then blindfolded, gagged, and his arms and feet were bound together, and his head was covered, barefoot as he was either led or dragged outside of the house and set on nearby railroad tracks. He was shot in the back of the head, the neck, and the back, and the lower parts of his body, and then he was set on fire. As I said, no matter how many times you read those details, they just sound absolutely horrific. And before we go any further in the discussion, a big rest in peace to Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. They absolutely did not deserve to leave the earth this way. But back in 2020, when I did an episode called The Execution of Lemaricus Davidson, I made the mistake of saying that Christopher Newsom's body was thrown in front of a train. As you heard there, he was placed onto train tracks, but I mean, more than 100 people gave me that correction. However, accuracy is important, and I do have to confess that I misstated that particular detail, and I am very disappointed in myself for doing that, because when I was first learning about this story, about what had happened in Knoxville back in 2007, there was a somewhat popular YouTube video at the time, which I believe has since been taken down, but it was of an African-American girl talking about how the news media should have covered this. The only reason why they didn't talk about this is because it doesn't suit their racial bias and so on. The racial bias narrative that they are trying to push nonetheless. However, she even made the statement that Christopher Newsom's body was thrown into the ocean, not even anywhere near Knoxville, Tennessee. And I was really remembering that was the only place that I had heard that. Clearly she had read up on the case somewhat, and the major points of her claims were talking more about the media coverage, so her argument wasn't really fractured by misstating that particular detail. However, as someone who went on to misstate almost the same detail myself, saying that Christopher Newsom was thrown in front of a train, and that's incorrect. I was wrong. I shouldn't have said that, and I should have been a little bit more careful with my words. But accuracy is important, and I will completely accept the correction. And if you do look more into this case, the Knoxville News Sentinel was all over the coverage. They have hours of coverage out there about the Knoxville nightmare and the actions of this group of people, and that is all available on YouTube here for free. One more time, the participants in the murder are George Thomas, who was known as Detroit, Latalvis Cobbins, who was known as Rome, Lemaricus Davidson, who was known as Slim, and Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd, who was known as E. There's a particular note about Vanessa Coleman when it says that she was 18 years old at the time. She was a Arrested by the Lebanon Police Department in Lebanon, Kentucky, she faces 40 Tennessee state charges. Coleman was indicted on 12 counts of felony murder, growing out of the rape, robbery, kidnapping, and theft of Christian and Newsom, 1 count of premeditated murder of Channon Christian only, 1 count of especially aggravated robbery of Christopher Newsom, 4 counts of especially aggravated kidnapping, 20 counts of aggravated rape, and 2 counts of theft. She was convicted and sentenced to 53 years in prison in 2010. But there was a particular reason why she was receiving that sentence of 53 years, because she was granted immunity for some of the actions, I'll just say that, some of the charges, some of the issues surrounding this case, some of them, but not all. So ultimately she ended up spending 53 years in prison. And with one participant, Latalvis Cobbins, he took the stand and he gave testimony. And in the second episode that I did on the Knoxville Nightmare, I said very clearly that if you do watch any video about this case, I highly recommend the testimony of Latalvis Cobbins. He is a twisted, murderous individual, and even though he gets on the stand and he gives somewhat of a calm and collected retelling of the events, he is still a twisted and murderous individual, and he deserves no sympathy. He deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. And it goes to show you that people will be extremely heinous if they believe that they are not going to be held accountable for these actions, or that if someone else is going to be taking a greater blame for them. But the reason why I think it's valuable to watch his testimony is because he talks about how people lie in the true crime world, how people manipulate information in the true crime world. When he's questioned by the police, he said that he told them the truth, but only bits and pieces of the truth. He leaves out all of the information in which there was something that could incriminate him. He's telling only the parts of the story that don't make it look like he did something illegal. And I think that ever since I watched that testimony, I've noticed that pattern happening again and again in true crime cases, whether you watch Forensic Files or 48 Hours, or I was recently talking about that show on Tubi, Meet Mary Murder. It happens again and again. But in the first episode that I did on the Knoxville Nightmare, I chose to do that episode and title it The Execution of Lemaricus Davidson for a very particular reason. I had been watching the movie The Gray Man, which is about the serial killer Albert Fish, and the first episode that I did on him, called Serial Killer Albert Fish, the Moon Maniac, here on Black Box Online Radio. Always inviting you guys to like and subscribe, follow along with all of these true crime discussions, or as I said, anything goes on Friday. I did that episode because I was watching the movie The Gray Man, and there's this actor who's playing the son of Albert Fish, and they're talking about how, our father had a rough childhood, that's why he's the way he is. And the son says, at a certain point, you have to stop looking at what happened to someone and start looking at who they are. And after he said that, the first person that I had thought of was Lemaricus Davidson. I learned about this case back in definitely 2011 or 2012, and I remember very clearly, after listening to that episode of The Savage Nation, watching some of the videos from the courtroom, and then finally getting to a point here that's actually summarized in an article from Wade.com, where we will hear from the defense attorney for Lemaricus Davidson, Doug Trant. And once again, Davidson was the ringleader of the Knoxville Nightmare. Defense attorney Doug Trant began his closing argument by saying, Lemaricus Davidson had a horrible childhood, and it's not an excuse, but an explanation on how he got here. And it was just it. Lemaricus Davidson was the first person I thought of when I was watching that movie. And that's not an excuse, but an explanation. No, sorry, unacceptable. At a certain point, you have to stop looking at what happened to someone and start looking at who they are. And in the closing arguments from the prosecution, the prosecutor in that case was named Takesha Fitzgerald, and she said, She told the jury Friday morning that Lemaricus Davidson had a tough life, but it does not excuse what he did. Life is about opportunities and decisions, the decisions you make. So what if he had a bad childhood, a crack-addicted mother, and so on? You still have choices, Fitzgerald said. Just obey the rules, Mr. Davidson, she says. But he doesn't. He won't. Davidson had an opportunity at age 16 to turn his life around, and when he was placed in the care of a loving foster family, his foster parents didn't abandon him, even in prison. Fitzgerald told the jury, "What does he do? After 6 years in prison for aggravated robbery, he comes to Knoxville to sell dope." At the end, Christopher Newsom had only his life, but he, Davidson, took that from him. Takesha Fitzgerald also said that Shannon Christian gave Davidson some of her trust when she told him she wanted to live. She didn't want to die, but he still killed her anyway. Then Fitzgerald said he didn't have to kill them. And that's just it, though, because in addition to that statement that I frequently use on the channel, at a certain point you have to stop looking at what happened to someone and look at who they are, I often frequently cite something found in the book Life Code, which says that the reason why previous abusive experiences are not a justification for bad behavior is because the abuser has conscious choice. They have the ability to say no. They have the ability to change their ways. They have the ability to alter their actions. And I'm not a big fan of lawyers. I'm not a big fan of prosecuting attorneys. And I'm not a big fan of the theatrical circuses that go on in courtrooms. But this prosecutor here, Takesha Fitzgerald, might be hitting the nail on the head when she says this man had numerous opportunities to turn his life around, and he kept going back to a life of crime, whether it's aggravated robbery, selling dope, or committing the torturous murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. He had the opportunity not to commit these crimes. At a certain point, you have to stop looking at what happened to someone and start looking at who they are. But in regards to the previous episodes that I've done on the channel, I fully admit that I jumped into the first one prematurely, and I wanted to talk more about some of the social issues surrounding the case, which I just laid out in the last 4 minutes here of this episode. But I also need to apologize once again for getting certain errors wrong, and also trying to go a little bit too far, because one of the sources that I cited in the first episode, titled The Execution of Lemaricus Davidson, was I was listening to a podcast called Babecast, which is just telling stories of women who work in different occupations. And one of the first episodes that I ever heard from that show was talking about a female prison guard and her experiences in the prison world and dealing with lots of violent male offenders. And in that episode, I talked about how I was planning to do the episode no matter what, but it just so happened that I was listening to that program, which isn't even a true crime show, and the woman, the female guest there, was talking about how she was in the same prison where Lemaricus Davidson was being held. But in the interview, she actually said Lemaricus Donald. And I was pretty sure she was talking about Lemaricus Davidson, and I even Googled to see if a guy named Lemaricus Donald had committed a similar crime, but nothing came up. It's quite possible she just simply said the wrong name. And I chose to use that information in the first episode because everything was lining up. It seemed quite clearly that she was talking about Lemaricus Davidson, and even saying the same story that he had a horrible childhood, he had a lot of rough life experiences, therefore he was entitled to get a free pass for the destructive actions that he projected into the world. He was entitled to get a free pass for all the crimes that he committed. So I shouldn't have included that info, though, because even though there's quite a high chance that she was talking about Lemaricus Davidson, I would never do something like that now if it really seemed like the sources were unconfirmed, or there was a high chance that maybe there is something else inaccurate in my episode. And I tried to do another episode, but that part 2 that I mentioned about the Knoxville nightmare, yet it simply did not catch on. And I don't know if it's because of the YouTube algorithm, or perhaps people are just simply frustrated with the first one, but I shouldn't have done some of the things that I did, and it's unfair to the victims, and it's unfair to the victims' families and the memory of Channon, Christian, and Christopher Newsom. I do have some final points here from Wade.com, which is also from the defense attorney for Lemaricus Davidson, Doug Trant, who says, Doug Trant reminded the jury of Dr. Peter Brown's statement Thursday in his testimony. He, Lemaricus Davidson, knows right from wrong when he's sober and not on a cocktail of drugs. Doug Trant told the jury that he knows they don't want to make the decision about Lemaricus Davidson's sentence, but it has to be done, and he says, I'm going to ask you to spare his life. Please, I'm begging you to do the right thing. Do you think that this will be the last death penalty case? One media player asked, and he said, we hope so, but we don't know. Okay, and excuse me, that final quotation was from Shannon Christian's mother, Dina, even though it was placed in that article there. Big thank you to Wade.com for providing that information. It is absolutely inappropriate as well to use this type of drug-induced behavior as an excuse for the heinous natures of the crimes. I mean, countless people have written into this channel saying that they've done drugs, but anything from cocaine to LSD to any type of drug, period. And they never murdered anybody. The whole thing about being high on drugs and that is what drove them to kill, or that somebody only knows right from wrong when they are sober, it's unacceptable, it's inexcusable, and it doesn't justify torturing people, setting somebody's body on fire, throwing someone's body onto train tracks. I mean, those are just so heinous and despicable, you can barely put it into words. I can provide perhaps a better motive for this murder, or perhaps an underlying psychological structure for the crimes that were committed that is not drug-related, and that is that the perpetrators in this case, who did those horrible things to Channon and Christopher, thought they were going to get away with it. They thought they were not going to get caught. And when people believe that there aren't going to be consequences for their actions, specifically consequences that they care about, they will do heinous, evil, and destructive things. They will commit actions that know no boundaries. Evil knows no boundary. And that's exactly what happened. You have to wonder, though, about all of the ridiculousness and sloppiness of the crimes and the way that they were committed. It's almost like these people were asking to get caught, like they were just begging to get captured, because leaving the evidence behind at the crime scene, which led them to the house, which still had human remains inside, it seems like they were just begging to get caught. Either that or they were just extremely unintelligent. But they were talking about the media portrayal and some of the Knoxville News Sentinel coverage about how the attorneys put Lemaricus Davidson in this sweater and they gave him a pair of glasses. I don't know what it is about glasses in the courtroom why defendants think that that's going to help them. I mean, everybody from Jodi Arias to that scammer, Anna Sorokin, and they even talk about it on the show 13 Reasons Why, about how the defense attorney advises someone to wear glasses in the courtroom. I don't know what it is about that, why they think that's going to help. It doesn't always help, but they're showing that when Lemaricus Davidson was not in the courtroom, the images of him definitely look like someone who was more of what you would call a creep. But the glasses didn't save him from getting the death penalty. He was sentenced to death and death by lethal injection, and I believe he is still currently on death row. So I apologize again for mistakes that I made in the past, and I hope that there's a sense of social commentary that will come from this episode, trying to encapsulate all of the info and the ideas that I wanted to share in episodes 1 and 2, but those will be available in the description box if you would like to listen to them. The best way you can support this channel is just by listening. You might hear some of the same info repeated, but you can see the evolution of Black Box Online Radio as well, and hope for the best, and I just hope that you guys will find some ideas that you might want to discuss in the comments section down below. The best way you can support this channel is just by listening, never asking for any donations. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com, and you can also connect with me on Facebook. Also, all of that's in the description box. BlackBoxNet88 on Instagram, Amazon.com, the Teespring page, all of that is in the description box as well. Many wonderful things there. And I will see you over on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.